Yeah, Michael Cohen's attorney, Lanny Davis, told NBC News last night, quote, Cohen is trying to reset his life as not being Donald Trump's bullet taker, or worse, a punching bag for Donald Trump's defense strategy where he takes the bullets. This is a turn for him. It's a new resolve to tell the truth no matter what, even if it endangers him. The White House declined comment and referred questions to Rudy Giuliani, who disputed the Cohen team's claim on Trump's use of the word cash.
Major point is it's outrageous that someone would tape his client surreptitiously. It's also foolhardy for them to try to kind of yell and scream and make believe what's on the tape. I agree with you, the tape is a little bit hard to hear, but I assure you that we listened to it numerous times. And the transcript makes it quite clear at the end that President Trump says, quote, don't pay with cash.
Jonathan Lemire, you also spoke to Rudy Giuliani last night. What did he tell you? And is it actually clear that the president is saying don't pay with cash?
What Giuliani told me late last night is that they have the recording and they have enhanced it. He said this is a tactic that he would do as a prosecutor. He said that when I would go after the mafia, we'd do the same thing. We'd have a muffled recording and we'd try to bring the better sound out of it. He says in that recording, it is clear that the president is saying don't pay with cash. Of course, and then they released a transcript that seems to back that up. They, of course, have not released that actual enhanced recording, so we have not heard that yet. We're just relying on the recording that Lenny Davis put out. But Giuliani's argument to me was that this is still backs up the president's argument, their camp's argument, that he didn't do anything wrong, that he was trying to do this above board. He makes the point that earlier in this conversation, you heard in the tape there, that they discussed maybe setting up a corporation to pay it. And they're saying, well, that must be, that, Giuliani's argument is, that is showing if the Donald Trump, then candidate Trump, and Michael Cohen are trying to obscure this, they wouldn't have set up a corporation. They wouldn't be discussing it by check. They believe that this is that Cohen's camp is trying to, muddy the waters here and change the argument to try to attack the president, and they feel very comfortable that that's not the case. They also said that they have 12 other tapes that they're going through. They don't believe that Trump is on them, but rather it's Cohen talking about Trump with third parties. They have said that they're debating whether to release them.
John Heilman, in listening to that tape, I don't know what you glean from it other than the fact that there are a lot of names mentioned. One of the most important probably is our friend David. And the question of why does the tape end so abruptly? Clearly the tape must be in control of Michael Cohen, but I don't know what else you find out in that tape if you're a prosecutor.
Neither do I, and I think there's the largest questions revolve around context, exactly what's happening before and after. Who's Donald Trump talking to when he seems to be having a telephone conversation with someone before the thing starts? Who's in and out of the room at various times? What's the reference to the Charlottesville issue that comes up twice, both in the telephone conversation and then also with Michael Cohen? There are a lot of questions about all of this, and I will say, though, that to me, from 30,000 feet, what is interesting about this most of all is that for a long time among Donald Trump's adversaries in the legal realm, you had Bob Mueller, who doesn't speak. And then you had Michael Avenatti, who does speak a lot. Michael Cohen did not have a representative who got involved in the kind of gamesmanship. He now does. Whatever you think of Lanny Davis, whatever you think of his motivations, whatever you think of why he's doing this, he's back. And he, like Michael Avenatti, is a skilled practitioner of the dark arts and the garish arts of media lawyering. So the president we now are in that place. And we had this back in the Clinton administration. We've had this at other times where we now have Rudy Giuliani, Michael Avenatti, Lanny Davis, all engaged in all of it. I don't have a problem with any of it, but all of them have obscure motivations. All of them are not telling precisely the truth. All of them are advocating and jousting on their client's behalf. And it takes us into the new, in a kind of a legal carnival kind of element of this story. That is going to raise. We're going to see a lot of stories like this that are going to come out in dribs and drabs, and the interpretive prisms that each side put on are going to be in stark conflict, and you're not going to know exactly what to believe until we get into a court, if we ever do.
Right. Well, and Rudy Giuliani has obviously already been doing that on the president's behalf. So to a certain extent, Michael Cohen would have been at a disadvantage.
Yes, for sure, for sure.
Betsy Woodruff, as we're trying to kind of sort through, all of the details of this and the context, etc. Jonathan was talking about exactly, who said that cash and this and that and the other thing. My question is still, why did the president's team want that out there? Perhaps they really do believe at the end of the day that whatever they have been able to enhance on this recording is clear enough that it clears the president. That's right. Giuliani asserted last week that there was material on this tape that was going to be exculpatory. Just from listening to the tape a couple times, that doesn't seem to be quite nearly as clear as Giuliani was claiming. And I think that's part of the reason that the Cohen camp was so willing to go out on a limb last night and put this tape out there. It's really interesting that both sides are sort of alleging that this tape is somehow going to be a magic bullet that clears their name. That clearly isn't the case. One thing I can tell you, though, is that Cohen's camp is increasingly aggressive. That's what we're seeing from Lanny Davis. Additionally, from talking to a person close to Cohen last week, another thing I can tell you is that people in Cohen's circle are increasingly encouraging him to affirmatively go to Robert Mueller. They don't know for a fact that Cohen has anything that could potentially be relevant to the Mueller probe, but there's a lot of hope, especially among critics of the president who are close to Cohen, that he might have something that could be relevant to that investigation. And they would like to see him sort of circumvent or perhaps a hopscotch over his negotiations with the Southern District of New York and go directly to the special counsel.
So, Noah Rothman, there are a couple interesting elements of this. There's the content of the tapes, which we're talking about, and then there's the act of releasing the tapes. As John says, you have Lanny Davis now out, and he said, quote, Michael Cohen is on a new path. It's a reset button to tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. So all this question about, might Michael Cohen turn on Donald Trump? Well, this looks like the beginning of that.
Yeah, it does. So we saw in the press a couple of months ago quotes from friends attributed to people close to Michael Cohen who are saying he wants his legal fees paid, he's willing to talk to Mueller. Sort of what seemed like an effort to strong-arm the president of the United States through the media, which is a very fraught strategy, but we're beginning to see, I guess, the fruits of that strategy sort of materialize. Again, back to the 30,000-foot perspective, you know, the cash, no cash thing seems like terrain that the White House thinks is more favorable. It's weeds, it's difficult to navigate, and it seems sort of irrelevant. You know, ascending to a broader perspective, you see the president who denied, through a spokesperson when the story came out, quote, the president says he never had a relationship with McDougal. That's flat out wrong. You know, what really solidifies the fake news narrative is your ability to suspend disbelief, to appeal to negative partisanship, say, I don't like the media, I'm going to believe the president over the media. This is really asking you to believe the president over your ears and eyes.
Well, you also have Noah Hope Hicks, as we point out, 4 days before the election, saying, quote, we have no knowledge of this. Donald Trump on that tape 2 months before the election does not sound like a man who had no knowledge of this.
No, they called it, again, this is an old story that is just more fake news. That is a quote from an unnamed spokesperson when the story broke in February. This isn't about news anymore. This is about the president speaking on tape to his attorney. The media is removed from this equation.
You know, really, maybe the ultimate value of this tape, and there are other tapes that we haven't heard, obviously, maybe as many as 13 altogether. Part of this tape that we just heard gets to what investigators / prosecutors continually try to get to, and in this case, try to get to with the President of the United States, and it's state of mind. What's his state of mind during the ongoing course of action, in this case, trying to figure out what to do about Karen McDougal? And is there going to be a payment? How much is the payment going to be? What's his state of mind?
Well, yes, and again, to go to a number of points that have been made here, there's a conversational familiarity between the two of them. It's clear this is an ongoing conversation that these two people are having about problems the president has. In this case, the fact that he's implicitly acknowledging that Karen McDougal is potentially a problem, and when he says, all we got to do is get through the next couple of weeks, there's a clear indication here that he recognizes the political peril if and a relationship that he has denied having were to become public, regardless of whether it's paid with cash or a check or through a vehicle or not. So I want to ask Michael Schmidt, Michael, a question that was just raised a second ago. This is obviously all interesting. It points out ways in which the president lied toward the end of the campaign. It points to potential campaign finance violations. But to raise the question that Betsy Woodruff raised, is there a place in which this story and where we think this story is headed, existence of tapes, is there a place where this story starts to overlap and cross over into the realms that Bob Mueller cares about?
Well, Mueller took the whole issue of Michael Cohen and his relationship with the president and these payments, and that was given by Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, to these prosecutors in New York. Right. So Mueller does not own that. I don't see any direct nexus between this tape and that payment and what Mueller is doing, but What it is that Cohen has a general Justice Department problem. And will the Justice Department allow him to deal with them together? Will he be able to go to the Justice Department and say, look, I know I have this exposure in New York. I may have this exposure in this Russia investigation. I may not. Here is what I can offer. What can you give me in exchange for that? So that would mean that Mueller would really to complete his investigation, needs to talk to Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen's name is in the dossier. Michael Cohen tried to arrange a business deal in Russia during the campaign. If Mueller is going to complete his investigation, he needs to talk to Cohen. So does Cohen go to the prosecutors in New York or go to Mueller and say, look, I'm ready to make a deal to sort of settle all of this, to do this all together and sort of make a global cooperation deal with the Justice Department? That's the question that we have to see.
Emily Jane Fox, as we wrap up here, your sense of what Michael Cohen's team wants now. Jonathan Lemire is reporting that Giuliani said there's 12 other tapes that they're reviewing. They're trying to decide whether to waive privilege on those tapes. Is that something that Team Cohen wants out in the open?
I think that there is going to be a calculated strategy about what serves Michael Cohen best going forward, whether that means withholding some things so that he has cards to show investigators if he does decide to cooperate, or if there's going to be more of this kind of drip, drip, drip leaking, then perhaps it serves them best to set the record straight. But what you have to understand is we're having this conversation about less than 2 minutes of an audio recording. There were almost 4 million documents and files and electronic devices seized from Michael Cohen's home, hotel room, and office in April. And that's not even to say what was not seized and what Michael Cohen knows. And someone close to Cohen said to me over the weekend, it's not what's on this recording, it is the backstory. So this skirmish that we're seeing between the two of them is dominating the news cycle for 24 hours. Imagine what's going to happen when all of those documents start getting leaked out in drips and drabs. The fights will just continue, and I think we're really just at the beginning of this.
That's the tip of the iceberg. Emily Jane Fox, great reporting as always. You too, Michael Schmidt. Thanks for being up early with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.